Dear ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to welcome you to the BICC Annual Conference 2022, which this year is entitled Infrastructural Power at Global Frontiers. The conference presents and compares findings from different case studies to discuss the factors that render infrastructural mega projects either as drivers of violence and conflicts or as facilitators of peace. We face today a new era of large infrastructural projects. Not only the hundreds of billion expensive Belt and Road Initiative is here to be mentioned. In Africa, currently 30 corridors crossing the continent are initiated. In Latin America, roughly 600 infrastructure projects are underway. So, since the last 2 decades, we witness the clear trend of the planning and building of large infrastructural corridors, including roads, power grids, railway networks, and pipelines around the world. The intention of such corridors is to create seamless connectivity across regions and continents. However, one has to consider that such mega projects also include infrastructural projects on a smaller scale. Infrastructure seems at first glance to be very concrete, material, and conceptually narrow. However, it is obvious that infrastructure not only includes the physical structure of roads, railways, or pipelines, it also includes a social dimension, namely the situated practices of infrastructure making. This means planners, architects, and policymakers organize environment via technical, material, and knowledge interventions. Accordingly, the planning of infrastructure reflects certain ideas, vision, and dreamscapes that governments and private entrepreneurs venture into these spaces, not only ignoring the social fabric of the people living there, but also diminishing them in regard to their culture and development. This is why conflicts about infrastructure projects are so often entangled with violent conflicts. It is not only because of the hardware of land rights, forced displacement, and questions of dispossession, but also because of the software that governments and entrepreneurs often enough ignore the life worlds of the people. In this respect, the aim of this conference is to discuss such entanglements between conflicts and infrastructure, but also whether and how such violence can be overcome. In addition, we want to discuss to what extent infrastructure projects may even be used to spur peace. Coming to the end of my welcome note, I'd like to highlight that BICC is currently part of several research projects to understand a better way the interface between conflict and infrastructure. Since 5 years, BICC is part of the collaborative research center CSC Rural Future Africa, funded by the German Research Foundation, DFG. In its sub-project Violent Future, BICC particularly focus on northern Kenya. In addition, we try to understand the impact of the building of new railway routes in Tanzania and in southern Kenya. And second, since 1.5 years, BICC is part of a consortium with the Humboldt University called D-Link Relink, where we are focusing on the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Here, BICC's research particularly focuses on the impact of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, so-called CPEC, in Pakistan, as well as on conflicts in Gilgit-Baltistan.
The goal of this conference is to take a look at different kinds of infrastructures, from transport corridors to various environmental infrastructures, to get insights on the questions, to what extent they generate old and new forms of violence, and what would be needed so they could spur positive peace in regions of infrastructure development. My name is Müller-Koné. I'm senior researcher at BICC, and for the past 13 years, I have worked on conflicts surrounding natural resource extraction. The physical geographical distribution of our conference team today also reflects the global approach to this conference, which is meant to bring together multiple perspectives on the topic. While Nadia joins us from Gilgit, Pakistan, Evelyne is currently based in Nairobi, Kenya. And I greet you from the city of Bonn in the Rhineland, Germany. The conflicts surrounding mega infrastructures often refer to the global south, but the conflicts and phenomena that can be located there also exist sometimes in the north, such as mobilizations against the Dakota Access Pipeline in the US or Stuttgart 21 in Germany. That is why we use the term global frontiers instead of global south for regions where large-scale infrastructure investments take place and local residents are disregarded or resistance to infrastructure is met with violence. So we hope to gain a lot of insights on the conditions for violence and peace across these different world regions today.
I would like to give just a brief structure of the conference. That is the two main projects that brought the idea together, if that's okay. So the conference was set by the theme of the collaborative research projects that we currently work on. My name, is Evelyne Owino. I'm a PhD student at BICC, and I'm looking into organized violence in northern Kenya, investigating its changing dynamics along the frontier constellations of Samburu, Pokot, and Turkana. So I'll be working along the large-scale infrastructure project that is the LAPSET corridor. So briefly, to give you synopsis of our project Future Rural Africa, that is Collaborative Research Center, CRC 228. It's funded by German Research Foundation. So CRC is a consortium that brings together University of Bonn and University of Cologne together with several institutes, like our institute, BICC, Bonn International Center for Conflict Studies, Center for Development Studies, ZEF, Institute of Crop Science and Resource Conservation, Global South Study Center, just to mention few. CRC takes current large-scale land use change in Africa as its starting point, looking into the intensification and conservation aspects. It investigates the impact of socio-ecological transformations in the context of three major growth corridors. That is, within East Africa, we have the LAPSET corridor, that is Lamu Port, South Sudan, Ethiopia, transport corridor. And we also have the Kaza project, that is Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area in South Africa. There is also the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor in Tanzania, that is SAGGOT. These are the three major projects that CRC looks into. The project team at BICC, that is within CRC, we aim to analyze the relations between future making dynamics and violence within East Africa. We are based in Kenya and Tanzania. And just to link CRC project with the LINK project, the LINK and ReLink project looks at local perspectives on transregional processes of entanglements and disentanglements. That is of the Chinese New Silk Road Initiative in Northern Rhine-Westphalia, that Pakistan. So the Research Network project uses the example of the Belt and Road Initiative, that is the BRI project, to investigate new spatial configurations and local perspectives on trans-regional infrastructure projects in Asia, Africa, and Europe. As you can see, CRC is based in Africa, within East and Southern parts of Africa. D-Link and ReLink project is also in Asia and Europe, but also Africa. So these, we thought as a conference team that we're having themes that we can work with. And within the D-Link project, my colleague Nadia is also the PhD student here. The project is funded by the Federal Ministry of Education, BMBF, and CRC. Within CRC, our big project and the D-Link and ReLink project, the PI is Professor Dr. Conrad Schetter, and in D-Link project together, they work with Dr. Katia, who is the project leader. So these two projects set theme for the conference by looking into not only socio-ecological transformations, but also entanglements and disentanglements that will set pace in different presentations that you will have in the process.
All right, thank you so much for the invitation to speak. It's really exciting to be here, and I feel quite honored to be the first one speaking today. I look forward to participating in the rest of the conference later in the afternoon. My plan for the next 15 minutes or so is to offer a response to one of the leading questions in the conference write-up, which is how can we understand conflicts around infrastructural mega developments in global frontier spaces? And I'm going to support my argument in response to this question by drawing on examples from LAPSET, which has already come up today, this mega infrastructure corridor that runs across northern Kenya. So as we've already been talking about, there's a lot of promises attached to mega infrastructure developments, but at the same time, we see more and more conflicts emerging as a result of these projects as well. And in attempting to understand these conflicts, why they emerge and mitigate them, a lot of the geography and development studies research has kind of coalesced around this idea that conflicts emerge around mega infrastructure projects because some people are excluded. There's beneficiaries of mega infrastructure developments and there's victims. And these victims often resist or protest and fight back from their exclusion, and this can lead to different types of conflict. And there are certainly cases where this is what's happening. And Evelyne's research on LAPSET and the Isikozlu airport in this LAPSET corridor development, how this displaced people, led to different land use change, rising property prices, is a really good example of how exclusion from mega infrastructure developments, people feeling victimized by mega infrastructure developments, can lead to conflict. But what I want to focus on today is a second type of conflict that happens that isn't a result of exclusion. It isn't a result of fears about being excluded or not reaping the benefits of mega infrastructure, but it's motivated, or the underlying driver is something different. And I would suggest that the second type of conflict we see happening around mega infrastructure developments relates to competitions between different types of infrastructures, competitions between built infrastructures that service modern capitalist liberal societies, and competitions between ecological or environmental infrastructures. So another way to understand these conflicts is that they emerge as a result of contestations over whose infrastructures are seen, valued, and invested in during this era of unprecedented infrastructure expansion, and whose infrastructures are ignored, destroyed, and replaced at the same time. And I'll support this argument with some examples from LAPSET now. But to begin, let's just define what I mean when I say infrastructure. So when we talk about infrastructure, we tend to focus on these built systems, and that's what the video clips, those really powerful video clips, kind of focus on as well. When we see reports on mega infrastructure projects on LAPSET or research, we think about these built systems, the pipelines, the roads, the railway lines, the cables and wires. And these are the systems that we see as underpinning the functioning of society. As Wakefield has written, these allow liberal capitalist order to succeed. And from this perspective, infrastructure are built additions that are added on top of nature, but distinct from nature, which is what Jensen has said. Yet not all infrastructure is built. And in various settings, and this is both in academia, but also in environmental sectors around the world, there's this growing acknowledgement about the infrastructural work that's done by nature. And this includes recognizing that nature forms the basis of built infrastructure systems. So a canal or a dam wouldn't work if it was just a concrete system. It relies on nature to function as it does. But it also involves paying attention to the work that nature does in and of itself. So nature maintains connections that are needed for society to function, just as built infrastructure does. Dry riverbeds or lagas in northern Kenya are just as important in terms of infrastructure, in terms of taking away water when there's flash flooding so that society can continue to function as a road is. So there's this move to recognize these diversity of infrastructures in some segments of academia and practice. When we look at LAPSET, we still see this emphasis on the built infrastructure. So we see emphasis on the highways, the railway lines, the oil pipelines, the electrical power lines within the immediate transport corridor of LAPSET. And in the wider economic corridor, we see emphasis on infrastructural components as well, the renewable energy stations or power stations, the export processing zones, the agricultural growth zones, the tourist zones, all of which come with different types of built infrastructure. Yet alongside this large-scale built infrastructure, there's expansive environmental infrastructures that are also being planned and constructed in the Lapset corridor. And this is true of any mega infrastructure development. So just as two brief examples, on one side of this screen is a livestock export zone or quarantine zone that's being built as part of Lapset in Lamu County. And this area is aimed at improving the national livestock sector. 30,000 acres have been demarcated for this holding zone for screening animals before they are destined for export. In this case, the land itself functions as the infrastructure that sustains livestock's life before they're sent to global markets. So the land plays an infrastructural role. And then on top of that land, you have all types of built infrastructure added on to the land. So fences, livestock housing, livestock loading and offloading zones or ramps, and even a small laboratory for disease testing. And combined, this social natural landscape or infrastructure provides the material substrate that allows livestock to be integrated into global commodity chains. So when we think about how infrastructure serves this role of creating a seamless global economy, nature is playing a role in that as well. It's not just the built pieces. Another example we can look at is the proposed rhino corridor in northern Kenya that would fall within the footprint of Lapset's economic corridor. This rhino corridor or rhino belt is proposed to take up 500,000 acres of wildlife conservancy land. If it were to go ahead, it would be several conservancies joining forces to create a large, secure migratory and dispersal area for rhino that would also benefit other species. The rhino belt is the exact type of project that Lapset aims to attract into the economic corridor. So the government of Kenya describes Lapset as a backbone for opening up northern Kenya and integrating it into the national economy. And these types of tourist landscapes or tourist infrastructures are part of what happens when northern Kenya is opened up. Should the project ever be fully realized, the protected ecological network would serve as really literal infrastructure for rhino. It's basically a giant rhino road to keep rhino safe, but it also is this more metaphorical infrastructure that allows tourists to be connected to airports, to infrastructure to get in and out of the area, and that connects Kenya to these global tourist markets. The problem is that these existing infrastructural arrangements, whether they're built or social, natural, or environmental, they land in spaces where extensive environmental infrastructure already exists. And while the environmental infrastructures that already exist may not provide the logistical underpinning for liberal capitalist order, they do sustain life. So in northern Kenya, there's all types of environmental infrastructures that are already in place that sustain Kenya's pastoralists. And in any rural landscape, you would have the same, just different types of environmental infrastructures. In northern Kenya, this includes transhumance corridors or strips of land that connect seasonal grazing areas. Along these corridors, there are various types of water infrastructure, boreholes, or sand dams, which filter water through sand in order to help keep it more clean. The landscape provides shelter, various landforms do, or vegetation that keeps people safe or sheltered. The landscape also is marked by different types of environmental features, such as lagas, which I mentioned, these dry seasonal riverbeds that absorb sudden rainfalls and prevent flash flooding, that help restore grazing land, that provide people with water at different seasons. So these are all examples of ecological infrastructures that sustain life in this landscape. When new mega infrastructure developments are planned, such as Lapset, they are often described as being planned for spaces that are void of infrastructure or that suffer from infrastructure deficits. So there's this discourse that these areas are in need of infrastructure, and the assumption or expectation that people will welcome new infrastructure with open arms because they don't have any. Yet the reason these spaces are seen to not have any is because environmental infrastructures are not counted or seen. As a result, mega infrastructure projects like Lapset are added on top of or sunk into natures that are already doing vital infrastructural work. And this can cause conflict to erupt as these new infrastructures threaten to interfere with existing infrastructural work done by the environment. So in the initial design of Lapset, as one example, there was a new dam proposed, the Crocodile Jaws Dam, which would dam off parts of the Owasso Nero River. to service a proposed tourism zone, but also an agricultural growth zone. If the dam were to go ahead, it would have submerged a large area of land under rangeland underwater. And additional land would also be sequestered for dam-related infrastructure, such as a power station. The dam was met with harsh resistance from pastoralists and conservationists alike, eventually halting the project, because they were worried about how this infrastructure would impact on wildlife, humans, and livestock, along with how the dam would permanently alter river flows. In this case, the conflict that arose was not a result, or not strictly a result, of fears of being excluded from the dam or the proposed infrastructural arrangement. Instead, this conflict can likely be better understood as fears about the pressure that the dam would create on the existing infrastructural work that was already being done by the land and by the water to sustain humans and non-humans in the region. Another example is around upgrading of border security in northern Kenya. And this has led some pastoralists to be concerned about how the formalization of border infrastructure will interfere with their existing transhumance routes. Historically, pastoralists in the far north of the country have followed their own routes between Kenya and Ethiopia, corridors carved in the landscape, co-constructed by people and livestock over centuries. These routes play a very important role in allowing pastoralists to sustain their livelihoods during dry periods, and elders and border officials have often reached unofficial or official agreements in order to allow pastoralists to balance their need with mobility with state security. The formalization of border infrastructure through projects like LAPSET adds a bunch of challenges for pastoralists. It slows their movement by adding layers of bureaucracy, and also threatens to bring them and their livestock into the reach of the state surveillance, or even taxation. And it's these types of fears that lead to tensions and contestations about what new infrastructure means for pastoralists' lives. In this case, pastoralists aren't fearful of being excluded from the infrastructure. They're actually more nervous about being coercively included in it and losing access to their existing environmental infrastructures as a result. When new infrastructures come into place, government actors, contractors, and financiers are often confused about why conflicts emerge, especially when these infrastructures land in places where people are seen as lacking infrastructures they need. They try to explain that the actual footprint of such projects is relatively small, that communities have been consulted and compensated, that what they're doing is within public interest and should create jobs and new markets. But there's a tendency, or what I think is often happening, is they're misconstruing what's happening, what the discontentment is about. It's not that people are against modernity, against modern infrastructures, or even fearful of being excluded or not benefiting from these infrastructures in many cases. In many cases, what people are more concerned about is how these new infrastructures will interfere with existing infrastructural work. And so this is an example drawn from a borrow pit that was unfilled alongside a major highway. And pastoralists have to cross across the major road now, but also through this unfilled borrow pit with stagnant water, which transmits disease. And actually it relates to one of the video clips that Marie showed as well. One of the reasons that these types of conflicts over new and existing infrastructures are so difficult to see is that these existing infrastructures aren't lost altogether. They just become less effective, less accessible, or slightly ruined in the process. So in this image, it's not that pastoralists can't move as they did before. It's not that they can't use their existing environmental infrastructures. It just becomes more dangerous to use them, more difficult, more inconvenient. Also, when we recognize that infrastructures and the environment are part of a system and systems function as a whole, loss of access to part of the system can have detrimental impacts or knock-on effects for the system as a whole. And this is particularly important when you look at areas of land that are being enclosed, such as a rhino corridor, or large area lands that are being set aside for certain processing zones. The knock-on effects of closing off access to certain areas will affect the system as a whole if we imagine this environmental infrastructure functions like a system. A main reason I would argue that authorities are so slow or fail to see and consider how existing environmental infrastructures will be impacted by new mega infrastructure developments is a result of the power of coloniality. And here I'm referring to those who have written the work of those who have written about coloniality, people like Quijano, who describe coloniality as ways of seeing, imagining, and knowing the world that both reflect and reinforce Western modernity and the needs of Western capital. Particularly in the post-war and pre-independence era, there was this emphasis by colonial governments, by big international institutions about the importance of modern infrastructure, the importance of highways, irrigation infrastructure, electricity infrastructure as central to development and modernization. This infrastructure was seen as essential to the substrate of each nation's pathway to modernity, as Karst writes, or as Larkin writes, it became so intimately caught up with the sense of shaping modern society and realizing the future that the possession of electricity, railways, and running water came to define civilization itself. And because these types of infrastructures have become so strong or dominant in our mind as defining civilization as what's needed to be part of a good or a modern society, when these infrastructures are absent, when they're not represented in our maps or images of space, there's this idea that there's no infrastructure, rather than seeing that infrastructure exists in these spaces, it's just less visible or differentially visible than the infrastructures we might be used to seeing. So this leads me to my final point, and that's what is the way forward? And I don't really have an answer to this, but I'll just pose two brief points in response to this question. On one hand, we could suggest that resolving conflicts around mega infrastructure developments that emerge as a result of this tension between different types of infrastructures would require making invisible infrastructures more visible, so that these could be factored into project plans. And taking this a step further, we could even suggest that there's a need to add value and invest in existing environmental infrastructures amidst mega infrastructure development. So these competitions between different types of infrastructure no longer exist. For example, instead of paying contractors to place boreholes at random spots along new highways, you could have contractors invest in existing water infrastructures that pastoralists use and rely on. Not only would this place more value, added value in the environmental infrastructures already at use, it would result in less changed migratory patterns, which can lead to new conflicts when new infrastructure is placed at random points in a landscape. On the other hand, it's likely that there's a need to be cautious about making these invisible infrastructures more visible. As Scott argued many years ago now, there are benefits to being illegible, and invisibility is not always a problem. By mapping and delimiting the ecological infrastructures that people use in these landscapes that are seamless, invisible, by making them visible and legible, while it may serve to better protect them, it may serve to mitigate conflict, there is also a risk that there can be negative consequences as well, often bringing invisible aspects of rural society into the public eye is a good way for the government or elites to capture them as well. So I'm not sure if making them visible is actually the way forward. But at this point, I will wrap up, leave with this kind of question or debate. But mostly, I just want to draw attention to these second types of conflicts that emerge over different types of infrastructure and competition. And I thank you again for the opportunity to speak today. And I really look forward to participating and listening in the rest of the afternoon.
Before we move into the first session of the conference, we have about 10 minutes for comments, questions, and answers.
You highlighted the tension and the competition between these two types of infrastructures. My question is whether one could also look at the relationship between the two more in terms of a constitutive relationship. So the road as a precondition for the establishment of the Rhino corridor, to what extent would that change the perspective on what you observed on infrastructures?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think, so I'm trying to write this up as a paper right now. It's probably actually something I need to think about more. There is this relationship between the different environmental infrastructures as well, that the environmental infrastructures that service modern global liberal capital order and the environmental infrastructures that don't. And I think what the road or the transport and built infrastructure does for different types of environmental infrastructures and whose environmental infrastructures it supports and whose it detracts from is probably something I can play around with a little bit more. And I also want to avoid getting into this kind of dichotomy between something always doing something bad or always doing something good, because there are certainly cases where the built infrastructure will do good for pastoralist environmental infrastructure. But I think until the designers, the planners, the architects are factoring this environmental infrastructure into their plans for the road, there's likely more chance of harm than good.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I found it really provocative and interesting. And, you know, I'd like to ask a bit of a provocative question myself. Just, I'm wondering, is there any danger of us taking natural systems or pre-modern sort of social systems and defining them as being infrastructure? Are we pulling things farther? Like if we start using the language of infrastructure to describe all the systems out there, are we not somehow setting up a certain kind of understanding about what nature is that may actually be moving us more to thinking of it in terms of kind of modern type systems? Is there a danger of that happening?
It's a really important question, and I think it's a challenge we face in trying to create equivalence between the systems that sustain different societies' life and also not wanting to pull these systems into, let's say, capitalist order, whatever we want to call it. And I think we kind of have to balance what we can achieve in stretching the term to include them versus what we risk. And in this paper, in the framing I'm using in this paper, I'm suggesting that there is more to be gained by recognizing that the systems that sustain pastoralist lives in this case are just as important and deserve just as much attention and value and investment as the systems that can sustain capitalist growth and economic growth. But I completely take your point that there are risks in doing that as well. And that's why we have the green economy, which we all know is very problematic. So
the question is, this is just donor pushed. It's the donor's interest. And we know that already the EU is now also in the war, in the competition, where now it's also come up with a basket to start funding infrastructure projects. So all I'm asking, maybe my thoughts or my thinking to you or questions to you is, what do you think about this based on your on your speech, given the fact that it's not just the Chinese. Now we have the EU coming in, we have the Americans coming in. So how do you use a systems approach in all this competition and confusion? Thank you.
You're right. There's space is needed and space often looks unused. But I think I would say in the long term, if we look really long term, it would be more sustainable to support infrastructures in place in northern Kenya that sustain people's lives that live in northern Kenya than to add new, very unsustainable systems and infrastructures to the region. But I'm not sure if that would appease a policymaker or a Kenyan government official. Like I said, I'm happy you're in that role instead of me. In terms of the confusion around who's investing in what in northern Kenya, I think this is a really important conversation to be had, and the contradictions between the EU and different government actors, development bodies, investing in very unsustainable infrastructure projects at the same time they're investing in basically the fortification of conservation areas and the closing off of conservation land to pastoralists raises really big problems about what the future of pastoralists is in this landscape and why development bodies aren't paying more attention to this. Because at the end of the day, investments in infrastructure and investments in large-scale conservation or ecological infrastructure do very little for pastoralists that live in the region. And I think there should probably be more attention brought to this kind of tension. I think there's the idea in the EU that by investing in environmental infrastructure, if we're calling it that, or conservancies, you offset the negative built infrastructure development. But what happens to people in this mix is getting lost in these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kara-san. Thank you, everyone, for posing the questions and comments. Now it's time that we move to the first session of the conference, which focuses on the conflict dynamics in infrastructure corridors, consisting of 2 breakout groups. The
the main question of the session was, what are the Chinese interests behind this, and in particular also what are the national or local effects, especially with regard to fostering either conflict or peace. Now, in a nutshell, whereas China likes to present the Belt and Road Initiative as facilitating harmony, cooperation, the road to peace, the main motivations are indeed economic, certainly in Africa, although in Pakistan there may also be additional strategic interests. I mean, after all, there is a close proximity to China, including the hope to pacify the country through economic development. So the main insight of the panel really was that this hope or expectation, facilitating peace, has not come to pass. The Belt and Road Initiative projects related to that tend to exacerbate conflicts rather than facilitate peace. Reasons, partly, we heard a couple of reasons in the panel, possibly because China exploits local labor quite a bit, takes a very state-centric approach with a direct focus on, cooperating with national elites rather than involving local population. But also it's not, only the fault of China alone, but also, at least in the case of Pakistan, a lack of capacities within society or the political system of the country, to equally share the benefits from economic investments. Now, what I've also found finally interesting in both presentations, there was a strong emphasis on security arrangements that accompany mega projects in China and Pakistan. So focus on security practices that rely on coercion and deterrence, local populations, indigenous people being perceived as a threat, rather than as a partner, and then necessitating the creation of special forces within the national armed forces, that often operating together with private security companies to protect the mega projects. And this, of course, again, only further alienates local populations. So all in all, no good news really from the first panel, but rather bleak picture here.
The first one was presented by Kennedy Nkutu of the United States University on the violence in the Lamu Port Lapsset corridor. And he made very important observations. For example, mega projects in rural Africa are presented by policymakers as having the potential to bring widespread socio-economic benefits, and the state also reinforced the same argument. But on the contrary, he also observed that this project brings disruption to rural livelihood, displacements, dispossessions, and exclusion. Also, policymakers view rural areas as unoccupied, unutilized, and therefore the need for civilization. It disrupts ecologies of social reproduction. It creates disorders to people's mobility and access to essential infrastructure, and it decouples their labor from transport systems like trucking, lorries, and disrupts the informal economy in general. So at the same time here, we find a lot of correlation with what Lesutis has said. For example, changes in natural resources governance, influx of newcomers to Lamu, ecological changes. For example, the people of Lamu in that Lamu port, their fishing grounds have been disrupted. It's like what Caris Ains said about the local infrastructure, the ecological infrastructure, which has been destroyed, and the people have difficulty fishing because what is recognized by the elites and by the planners is the built infrastructure only. And he also found that it undermines limited possibilities of self-sustenance, and it also denied the people justices, even if that justice is restored to them through courts and other forums. Finally, he engaged the theory of the politics of disavowal, which argues that mega infrastructures a specific form of state violence because the state denies responsibility to support vulnerable populations, and the disavowal subject is regarded absent and materially unaccounted for and is abandoned to survive on his own. In the end, we had many questions which were not answered because of time.
So starting with the one on the MENA region, this was looking, so this was Benjamin Schütze presenting, taking the example of an electricity ring that is in different stages of being implemented, so it's not yet completed at all. But the interest is to connect electricity grids so that electricity can flow to the European Union. And he has looked at this also in the angle of what the European Union welcomes and what is not welcome. At the very end of his presentation, he contrasted the energy flows with the stopping of migrants on the Mediterranean. But now I've jumped a bit too fast. So he was looking well, really contrasting this promotion of a community of fate, which this is how this project is being promoted or presented, and yet there is a huge disconnect when it comes to the access to energy itself. Looking at, for instance, projects in the eastern part, so where Jordan and Israel for instance, have a project for, there's a project on gas export from Israel to Jordan, and the question of energy access by Palestinians was raised. Another question was the governance structures that exist in the MENA region in contrast to the European Union. And another question was the renewable energies that are being promoted as part of this project versus the fossil fuel lock-in, which means that, for instance, in the, I'm really sorry, this was very fast. So this fossil fuel lock-in, for instance, in the project in Jordan, where the contract that Israel and Jordan have drawn up for this gas import and export means that Jordan is importing gas, and this has stopped renewable energy production in Jordan. So this is one of an example of the fossil fuel lock-in. And another question was that of carbon emissions outsourcing. I found interesting in the discussion, one example was given on Spain, which is relying highly on energy from the MENA region, for instance, also for its agriculture, and also on migrants working in that section. The second presentation focused on geothermal projects in Kenya. So this is going back to a project that started in the 1980s in the Maasai lands, so the pastoralist community of the Maasai. And Mr. Daniel Ogai presented on this one and shared how the development visions of the national government and also partially of internationally or like at the African level and at the national level can contrast with development visions at the local level. He summarized at one point that Maasai community is often perceived as being reluctant to development, but that this is rather a misperception, and that what they would like is more a development at their own pace and not at this often rushed pace of investors and of these development visions, for instance, in Kenya Vision 2030 and others. He also asked the question of development by whom and for whom. And this also goes then for climate change mitigation. So whereas geothermal power is a sort of a renewable energy source and helps combat climate change, he asked the question of who is benefiting from this, and if there are in the end people also displaced by this process, whether this could they be labeled as also climate refugees.
We discussed in our breakout session the violence inherent in disasters associated to different kinds of dams in different contexts, namely Laos and Brazil. The session was chaired by Professor Elvan, Professor for Development Geography at the University of Bonn. And we had two presentations, very insightful presentations by Professor Ian Baird from the Department of Geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Professor Bruno Milanes from the Department of Industrial and Mechanical Engineering at the Federal University of Juiz de Fora in Brazil. So the first presentation by Professor Ian Baird was about catastrophic and slow violence of a hydropower dam in Laos. And he takes the collapse that happened of this dam in July 2018 and the subsequent disaster it caused to analyze the links between the two concepts of catastrophic and slow violence, and to demonstrate also the crucial role of time or temporality in it. So he elaborated catastrophic violence is a particular form of violence that occurs rapidly. It's like rapid onset disaster. It has a devastating impact on life. It gets a lot of media attention, and also a lot of humanitarian aid then comes in. So it also gives like corridor for forms of contestation. While then there is the notion of slow violence, mainly from Nixon, that slow violence occurs gradually and especially dispersed. It is linked to poverty-induced policies, or to structural injustices, and it's usually hidden from, it doesn't get this attention, it's hidden from the public, or it is silent. So he gives the example that actually in the case of this hydropower dam, it was already during the construction of the dam, like what we know what's happening a lot with these dams, there's a forced resettlement of people from their homelands, and they were referred to areas where their living conditions were much worse. And then the interesting point is when this catastrophic event happened, there was like all this media attention for the people directly affected, but actually these people that had been resettled all these years before, they had never received this attention, also not after this catastrophic event. And then he argues that also there are these linkages, or there is this transformation of catastrophic violence into slow violence with time passing, when, for example, the recovery of the people, like the affected people were referred to to other areas, which were like basically like refugee camps, and they exist until today. So the recovery has been very slow. But nobody, again, is interested in their situation now because it's not anymore framed as a disaster. So what he argues then, that it is important to look also, especially at these ongoing, and also at these relations between the two, in order to understand actually when and how, and also to whom this environmental violence occurs. Then the second input by Bruno Milanes was about illegal and legal contours of a tailing dam disaster in Brazil. So another disaster that happened, also dams collapsing. And he brought to us the attention to the mining industry in Brazil and how dams are built, tailing dams. So these are dams that hold back the tailings. Tailings are, correct me if I'm wrong, fine-grained residues from the mining industry, so highly contaminated stuff, residues. And They have been built in Brazil, especially in one area, like many of them. And over the past years, there have been several disasters connected to it, especially in 2015, there was a major break of one dam, which caused also deaths and deaths of people, and the mudslide destroyed livelihoods and contaminated the riverbed. So he is wondering also what makes this reoccurring. And he found like 4 maybe political reasons for it, which is first regulatory capture, the strong lobbying, the strong ties between the public sector, the the mining corporations, and the government, then ineffective environmental policies, for example, how permits are given to construct these kind of dams, intentional legal loopholings, which gives actually the mining companies much control and power over the local populations, and the privileged access of mining companies to the judiciary. So as a way out, he has observed that the social contestation that has already existed locally in this area has been upscaled also on a national level, and their strategies have also diversified. So it ranges from publications to participation in public hearings, especially from this one company, Swaleh, which is one of the, had been a state-owned company and it's now like a private mining company. Also political education, advocacy, and the like. So this he suggested as a way forward. And then in the discussion, we have actually gone more into detail into both cases, also to make comparisons. We found like a lot of similarities when it comes to this state corporate complex in both countries. Also like what it is like the violence for the people, also the stress the fears they have, which is for settlement or potential for settlement in case of a disaster. Also the question if these can be generalized to other infrastructure, which has been like slightly answered with yes. But then mainly the discussion evolved around more like theoretically driven, I would say, around the terms used, especially the term violence, how it is used, if it can be used in this broad way, and that it's important to make the distinction between the risk and the violence, but also to link them, to see them, to not to decouple them. And also there was a suggestion if it is possible to make this distinction between a purposeful violence used and an unintended violence or not necessarily intended violence, which then draws the question, but where to make the line, like where does one end, the other starts? Is it actually unintended if deliberately dams are not constructed safely because it's cheaper? Something like this. Also the question, where actually does violence begin? And finally, there was a comment about it that also violence perceived is not the same as violence enacted. So there were like much discussion, and I think this would have been interesting to go much deeper into the theoretical ideas of the terms. Also, of course, the role of then Galtung's concept of structural violence here in these case studies.
The question was on conservation infrastructures and how can they contribute to peace. Our first presentation was by Dr. Brambücher and from the University of Wageningen. I'm sorry, don't know the pronunciation, South Africa. And the question wasn't answered directly in the sense, we don't know if they can, but what he tried to bring forth was that what we see is the use of infrastructure to harden property, to harden political economies. And I guess the question, can they contribute to peace, is, well, to what degree can they be softened? Can these infrastructure as concrete and tangible as fences, which are in South Africa, a ubiquitous form of boundary making, can they be used to soften property and political economy, and perhaps in that way contribute to peace? So I kind of relate this session and this discussion in this way. In order to be able to answer this question, which I understand that Dr. Bisha is not far enough yet to be able to say this, but we basically need a rethink of the conservation paradigm. So we have to go beyond the dichotomy of people and then environment, but to a concept of living, in together, in biodiversity, but not necessarily without boundaries, not necessarily without senses, literal or figurative. So how means a rethink at this point, and this is what he was really calling for in his presentation. And it was nicely complemented by Johannes Dittmann from the University of Bonn, in my opinion, because he gave us a very concrete example of the CASA project, which I learned is a very large transboundary conservation project, so wildlife, national parks, and it crosses over 5 different countries, Namibia being one of them, which he did his research in. And here you have an idea of, no boundaries within this boundaried and bordered area. And this vision of this being a free area, and what he learned in his research as well, such great and grand visions are easily overtaken, manipulated, used for their own political gains by the leaders who have the most power and access. So, these great visions also don't come to fruition. So we have to have our visions and have our rethinks, but also, look a little bit more at the narratives that are underlying them. So this idea of a boundaryless cross-border area actually was a very boundaried area. And in our discussion, we went into the direction of, starting from a very abstract idea of conservation to a very concrete implementation of it, and the need to now pick it apart a little bit to see what the next evolution of this concept could in fact be. And one thing that really stuck with me is also something that Johannes also mentioned in his presentation, which is the need to perhaps start small. So these grand vision making often leads to trouble and loss of motivation when it doesn't work, but keeping it small, working at the community level, and having some small wins along the way is perhaps a way to reconceptualize all of this. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
We are now into the final session of the conference. The final session will discuss prospects for peace, implications for practitioners and policymakers. My colleague, Evelyne Owino, will chair the final session. Over to you, Evelyne.
I welcome you all to our final session, Prospects for Peace, as Nadia has explained. So I'm excited about this because I promise you our presenters are only going to take 4 minutes and 59 seconds. So this last session will be the shortest. And then after that, we will have an open session discussion with the audience. And in terms of structure, then we will have a reflection session and then concluding remarks. So it's a very short but packed session. So in order to link the 2 previous sessions with this session, I would first open this final session by, an article that one of these writers, Andrew Mould, placed when he was looking into infrastructure and historical development, history of development and perspectives in Africa. And he asked this question: will it all end in tears again and again? What are we not doing right? What are we not doing wrong? So we will dive deeper into ways we can prevent conflicts and move away from fragility that is towards resilient societies as policymakers develop these infrastructure visions and also practitioners implementing them. We all know that states sometimes tend to adopt systemic efforts and institutionalized approaches to build necessary capacity of managing conflict. So in order to hear more about the best practices, some of the lessons learned, what worked, what didn't work, I will introduce our first speaker, who will give us a presentation of 5 minutes based on some of the areas he has worked on. Our first speaker is Ralph Schneider. He is the head program at the Department of Construction International Cooperation in Eschborn, that's GIZ. He is responsible for the operational team abroad, which implements infrastructure measures in a wide range of countries in increasingly fragile contexts. So prior to his current position at GIZ headquarters, he worked in the field of international cooperation in different countries such as Benin, Ethiopia, Tunisia, Mali, and Bangladesh. Mr. Schneider, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Complexity in political and socioeconomic challenges were completely different regarding the areas we were working on. I would like to give you an example. I was working in a program, food security in Mali in the Sahel region, which was facing the problems of regional development regarding first of water irrigation systems for the food security, and we had very good experiences regarding local participatory approach with the local groups, which were, by the way, completely different. I would like to give you a little bit of a feedback regarding the groups we were working with. We were working with, for example, Fonalis, which is a group with a pastoral background, and then we had conflicts regarding the agriculture sector, which were the Dogon working in. That was in the Dogon country in Mali. And in another region, we had different conflicts because there we had agricultural people, but with different religious background. For example, in the northern part or northeastern part of Mali, they were working with the Tuaregs, which makes about 10% of the local population, but they had quite huge either political and as well historical power on all the other groups we were based in the area. So we had to work with a participatory approach to be able to respond to the individual needs of the individual groups which are based in the areas. The participatory approach as well regarding the maintenance to ensure the sustainability of the infrastructures, and as well to hinder or to prevent any further conflicts in the future after the realization, and as well in a regularly time period, a follow-up with the different groups and organizations and local authorities, which were, or the regional authorities as well, which were part of the different projects. So that would be one of my positive examples regarding infrastructures, and yeah, a little bit of a positive approach how things can be prevented right from the beginning.
And I'll stick to my 5 minutes. So thank you very much for having me. I am a political scientist, but I'm not an academic. But I've learned a lot about some of the concepts that you presented today about the academic approach to it, which I found very interesting. And I think sometimes they're implicit in our work, but probably not explicit. So that was quite interesting to hear. And I hope that I can also have some insights from a more practical perspective, which will be helpful or interesting to you. So this conference is called Infrastructural Power at Global Frontiers. Obviously, the word frontier triggers not so good feelings for an Indigenous rights activist, which I consider myself. You know, I have a picture of, I don't know, genocide and land theft in the Wild West, which is quite strongly connected to the idea of frontier. And I have to say that also big infrastructure projects today cause more negative feelings when I hear a big infrastructure project. So often I think of negative examples. I think of, you know, big hydroelectric dams, for example, that kill fish and river ecosystems that indigenous peoples rely on or that flood their ancestral lands. I think of roads, big road projects that cut through indigenous territories. And sometimes they bring disease, settlers, logging, and the extraction of resources on the indigenous territory. Or I think of national parks or protected areas which expel indigenous peoples in a kind of idea of wilderness and expose them to torture, rape, or killings when they try to re-enter these territories. So big infrastructure projects for me remain, I think, a big issue of control of territory at the expense of indigenous peoples who are often brushed aside as being somehow incapable of managing their land efficiently to whatever aim, you know, in this regard is perceived to be achieved by this project. But obviously this part of the debate is also prospects for peace, ? So it's a bit more positive, which also Mr. Schneider touched on. So I really try to think of good examples. I didn't really come up with a good example of a, you know, successful big infrastructure project. Very sorry about this, but I remembered a survival report we published many years ago, which was not so happily also called Progress Can Kill. And it focused on the impacts of development on local indigenous communities, which at the time basically consisted of large infrastructure projects, so the idea of development. And I think there are a lot of things that we can learn in our debate today from, you know, this debate then. And I picked 2 quotes from indigenous speakers, which I think can illustrate 2 maybe more positive things and things that we can, you know, explore so that big infrastructure projects don't make us feel so terrible. So the first quote is from an indigenous leader from the Dongria Kont in India. And he said, "It's crazy when these outsiders come and teach us development. In our land, we don't have to buy water like you, and we can eat anywhere for free." So I think this already points into a direction that we touched on earlier today, that, you know, resources, infrastructure, and kind of development already exists on indigenous territories, which is often perceived to be the target of infrastructure projects, even though, you know, it may differ from the mainstream perception. And this is true for water, shelter, or food, as in this quote, but also, for example, for conservation areas, you know, they impose a particular Western model of conservation over existing indigenous land management tactics. So it's not like there wasn't anything before. It's really about, you know, it's more a question of power, not so much a question of infrastructure. And I think understanding this is quite key, so we can, you know, question the purpose of infrastructure projects, and we can maybe question this idea that, you know, we all want the same thing done in the same way, which obviously is not true. And it can make these differences in perceptions visible, and we can see potential conflict lines instead of silencing them. And the second quote I brought, and I'm conscious of time, I'm almost done. It's from a Yanomami speaker from Brazil, and he said, "It's not that the Yanomami do not want progress. They want to be able to choose and not have change thrust upon them, whether they want it or not." So I think this points to another second important point. You know, it's not about you know, if we want progress or what kind of life we want, but it's also about the kind of how we reach these decisions when we have competing ideas about how things should be done. And consent is obviously a very important issue, also in international law, giving consent to projects, and it needs to be in an adequate setting for marginalized indigenous communities. This also often means that they have land rights secured before they start some kind of negotiation about their rights. And I think in this way, if we address these two things, these are just two quotes I picked, and I think two issues for me, we can start addressing issues of justice, which I think in the end can help us, you know, promote and forge peace.
I will perhaps just start going back to the polling you did in the beginning, because it became very clear in the polling that there are somehow mixed emotions about the positive and negative outcomes of infrastructure. And I think that's true. I think if we go back to infrastructure, we can say infrastructure is always there. I think that's quite key. So it's not bad or good as such. It's just, I think, if we consider infrastructure, in particular large infrastructure projects, it's much about doing things or making things faster, smoother, more reliable, or more convenient. I think that's important just to keep in mind that infrastructure per se is always there. So it depends on very much on the context and the way how to put infrastructure, a new infrastructure, into practice. I think this is important to keep in mind. In the last 4.5 minutes, I just would like to focus first more or less on the concept, and to approach the concept from a different perspective, from the perspective of conflict studies, and not so much from the perspective of political ecology. And second, I would have 3 direct comments on the policy, or on the level of policy making and for practitioners. I think if we talk about infrastructure from the perspective of peace and conflict studies, I think it's important first to be very clear about to make a difference between conflict and violent conflict. And you know, conflicts can also be seen in a productive way. It might be that there's new infrastructure projects, conflict come up, and you have in the end, the conflict leads in a productive way to a new stage of cooperation in future. So you can see it also productively. But I think what became very clear in this discussion here is more or less the violent dimension of conflicts. And I think here we have to differentiate 3 different levels. I think they're all very important. The one is, of course, the issue of physical violence, but also became clear in this presentation, particularly if we talk about the securitization of violence. And I think what we often can see is that particularly large infrastructure projects come along with a huge new arrangements of physical violence, what we can call securitization, with new private security forces, with the whole way of trying to secure with formations of physical violence these new infrastructure projects, particularly in way of how infrastructure projects are enforced, are put into place. I think their physical violence plays a huge role, and of course, vice versa, the way how when protest becomes violence because it's using brute force. I think this is one very important issue here. Taking the second level is, of course, what we also was just mentioned, the whole issue of structural violence. I think the whole question where we talk about inequality, and I think particularly we have to understand that large infrastructure projects are often projects which are imposed by external actors on external actors. So we have always this divide, this gap between the external actors coming to an area and the internal actors. And I think this is something where one has to think about how to cope with the situation, and in some particular how to find a situation not to increase the social gaps, the social inequalities within the society. And I think here one very important issue is, and this was also mentioned in some presentation, we have also consider the level or the dimension of law. thinking between legal and legitimized ways of doing things. So it's not only about following a legal framework, but also you have to ask the question to what extent certain interactions by imposing certain forms of, new infrastructure are legitimized. So I think the whole question of legitimacy comes here in, becomes very important. One issue which I would just like to mention, we talk also about here this divide between the state interest and the interest of the economy. And I think we have to be cautious about always to have in our mind the paradigms of the liberal economy. We should not forget that I think the largest infrastructure projects were done by a state-oriented economy, particularly by the socialist states, by command economies, by the developmental state, particularly in between the 1950s and 1980s. So I think that brings, it is important to keep in mind that this issue of large infrastructure project is also one which is put to the forefront by states. And third, of course, I think it's important, this is what we are doing here in our institute a lot, to thinking about organized violence. I think the whole question about how infrastructure projects are realized and hereby certain new forms of organized violence is brought in. I think Bram mentioned in his presentation the issue of fences, for example, the whole question how materialized representations of violence are brought into the picture, how certain new norms are here imposed. And I think here we see a lot of ways how certain ideas of how violence is organized are brought in by infrastructure projects, which are very often defining the way how access is granted or not. And I think this is something one has to consider. Saying this, I think for the policy and practitioners level, I think there are three issues one has to consider. The first, I think, is of course, to be very sure about, and I think what was also made very clear in both presentations about the social fabric of the situation and what are the demands of local societies, and I think the full understanding of a society. I think that's very, very important to understand, is that an area in which a new infrastructure project is built in is full of social fabrics, of certain kinds of expectations for new projects, and they all have to take and considered and outbalanced. But I think it's really a very difficult endeavor. Second, I think it's important, and I think this is often not seen, if a new larger infrastructure is built in, nobody is neutral. I think it's nothing where you're coming in and just bringing somebody on new enterprise, just bringing in the new good infrastructure project, but you're always party. And I think this is something where one has to be always very clear about and reflect about its own position. And this goes perhaps even beyond the idea of do no harm, but I think the own positionality should be part and parcel and always considered. And I think the third point is what we learned in our context, where we are dealing with a lot with conflicts, is that conflicts are never static and are never in a way that you have only one cause. But I think what we see is, of course, that conflicts are very dynamic. The context is changing a lot. So I think it's very important to consider how these conflicts, which are these conflict settings in which infrastructure projects are taking place, are always changing. And this is one thing I think which has always to be considered. This means also that the meaning of a large infrastructure projects is changing time and again. And I think this one also should be considered.
Just quickly, 3 points that I can throw there as you put your questions together is from Ralph, we can learn that a local participatory approach can work if it's done in the right way. Then we can have infrastructures that are also pro-peace. Then with Linda, what are the purpose of infrastructure? There are so many questions that we should put in place and consider before undertaking such mega transformations, especially among the indigenous communities. And with the last speaker, Professor Conrad, we can also see that conflicts, not all conflicts are bad or negative. There are also positive conflicts that can lead to productivity in the end. Also, after war, after conflict, there is always restoration. So sometimes we need certain conflicts to also help bring prospects for peace. Maybe my first question to the panelists, to the speakers as I wait for others, would be especially to Lena. When you talk about indigenous community and issues of land, we deal with that a lot, especially in Kenya. My work is in northern Kenya and I'm working with pastoral communities. And these mega projects are targeting their spaces, and these are people who depend on land for grazing, and they've had a traditional way of living. So my question would be, what are the symbolic and cultural attachments to land that, that these developers tend to rush and not, they don't want to pay attention to this. And this, in our case, this is what is actually triggering violence, because these communities feel like you are undermining us as much as you want railway or road to pass through, yet you don't want to put our cultural issues into consideration. Like one of the rapporteur was giving the summary that, when they were presenting on the issues of Maasai geothermal, it's not like the indigenous community, the Maasais do not want development, but they want development at their terms and their pace, not being rushed into, accepting and making agreements that they don't even understand. So what would be your take on that? Because your talk triggered something, especially on land.
I think land is such an important issue. I mean, for, many people, but also particularly for indigenous peoples. We always say, and I think it's actually a quote we take from different people in a mix. So often they describe the land as like the supermarket, which is quite straightforward. You get what you need for living and sustaining yourself from the land, but it's also the church. So there's belief systems attached to the land. It's the pharmacy or hospital. So often there's like medicinal plants that you can use on the land. It's the school. So a lot of the things that you teach your children are related to the land. So it has a very particular and strong meaning. It's not like you can just kind of move indigenous peoples to another patch of land and it'll be all good because they'll have some land. It's a particular area that, is very important to their identity. We've often seen that if they're being evicted, that this causes social breakdown, conflicts, and shorter life expectancy, for example. So that's quite crucial. At the same time, this particular relation to the land is often you made the problem. So it's kind of like, these people use the land as their supermarket, which they shouldn't. They should be using these resources, or they should be not teaching their children about the land, but they should send them to school. So there's it's being made a problem, and often in infrastructure projects or development projects, it's particular this relationship which is being targeted because of competing ideas of how it should be, and of not consulting with the people that are affected by these projects of what they actually want. I think that is my take, but yet not to underestimate the importance of land.
I mean, this issue with land that followed me in many different projects and countries, and it is a mostly underestimated issue. I face it myself. A very simple example on that is an open well. When you are building a well on somebody's ground, he has got the power of water for everybody in this community. So by unintended impacts, if you are not really studying well in advance, or by what I mentioned before, this participatory approach, you really figure not out what are the real what is the real situation in the area you will build an infrastructure, whatever it is, either a road, either a dam, or big buildings or whatever. If you do not consider the land rights of the people and who is the owner of what, and that's another point now I would like to add as well. This is not only by legal aspect. This can be a religious issue. This can be a historical issue. And if you do not consider this in an appropriate way in advance, this can then we come back to the creation of potential conflicts in the future you are not even aware of.
I think it became clear from a number of presentations that violence and conflict in infrastructure construction is to some sort unavoidable. On the other hand, we probably also would agree, that was a point Kennedy Mkut made in his talk, that governments in developing countries do insist that infrastructure is needed for regional development. Now, my question is for people engaged in development, like Mr. Schneider, what do you expect from research? What can we learn from the research the scientists in the room are doing? And in which way does your view somehow conflict with the view of Linda Popper, who probably would see development in a different way from how you see it? So what can we learn from the research we are doing in order to mitigate the negative effects of infrastructure construction?
Indeed, it is. I absolutely agree with you. It is always a conflict field when we talk about infrastructure. Even though if you do the right studies upfront in advance, you invite all groups which are in the area you want to intervene, but the experience always showed that you are never able to consider each and everybody. If you want to implement an infrastructure, I fully agree on that. Then the real problems will come out. Coming back to your question regarding research upfront in advance, it is as good as possible to consider to study the potential negative impacts, including unintended impacts, which is mostly forgotten in most of the research fields. In my experience, even myself, I completely underestimated in my personal history certain problems I was not aware of certain things. I was going with a positive and in my point of view, good and positive approach into a project. And after finalization, I figured out that there was some unintended impacts. I was not happy to see them. What I wanted to say is, as more people are involved in during concept phases already, or research upfront, from all different groups. I just mentioned religion groups, for example, could be an issue in some areas. As easier the project can be implemented, and as less negative impact the infrastructure measurement will get to the people. Of course, you will always have, on the one or the other hand, a negative impact regarding environmental negative impacts. But this as well has to be studied upfront to make the negative impact as less as possible. Because for some infrastructure projects, there are not really any alternatives. When you talk about energy or water, people need it. If not, you will have a migration problem by the end of the day.
We made a little word cloud with impressions from a few colleagues, so this is not representative. Let me just quickly put that into a presentation mode. Not representative, but still a bit interesting that the state appears so big. That was already mentioned in the final discussion. What I took from several groups is that the collusion and the alliances between companies or capital and state, and the historical interconnectedness is quite important in many contexts. We see a great deal of uncertainty, risk, interests, and history that play a role here. Yeah, but this is just a snapshot, and certainly there are many things we missed. So I will just go on with some key aspects that I saw in the discussions, starting with the keynote that introduced us to a notion of ecological or environmental infrastructures, which really put the notion of infrastructure upside down for many of us, I think, but certainly helpful in somehow balancing build with natural or ecological infrastructures and putting them on an equal footing conceptually. Then I saw many disconnections, divides, and misperceptions in the discussion. So disconnections between global, national visions and hopes for the future and local visions and how the infrastructure plans are implemented. The call for maybe smaller plans and also more tailored solutions. Misperceptions of local communities being not interested in development, being not sedentary. So that's obviously still plays a big role in conflict surrounding infrastructures. Several dimensions of displacements were mentioned in the breakout groups, from colonial displacements that are continued, repeated, to development-induced climate refugees and displacements by catastrophes. Contested landscapes were mentioned, which were, I think, an issue in several contexts. Contested landscapes between people, wildlife, and the infrastructures being built. Temporalities also played a role, from colonial continuities to the distinction between catastrophic and versus slow violence. Framing and discourses were also an aspect that was taken up again and again. That often the framing of those infrastructure projects has a decisive role in how it's then being perceived, reacted to, and implemented finally. And then what I found very interesting is that the notion of violence was rather contested at this conference here. We had different notions, different kinds of violence presented and debated. But what is remarkable, I think, is that it played such a central role in the conference. The discussion running between intentional and rather if there is anything like unintentional violence or not. The importance of the kind of infrastructure from the poll and from the conference design would indicate that there's a high, it's decisive, a kind of infrastructure that is designed and built. And I personally took from the breakout group on renewables this important distinction between central, mega, and decentralized solutions that, the smaller the infrastructure, probably the better for peace. But overall, for the entire conference, I rather take that the kind of infrastructure for the issues and problems and dynamics that were presented does not make such a big difference between the different kinds of infrastructures. So that was my personal takeaway here. And just to end maybe with some questions on peace, which are open in the end, is, I think, in order to achieve lasting peace, or whatever, some positive piece. I think the open question is still, what kind of infrastructure do we need? How to bridge the social inequalities within societies, and what kind of societies do we want in the end?